Paxson O'Connell wasn't on the guest list, but when you own the theater chain, you don't need an invitation to your own movie premiere. He slipped through the side entrance of the red carpet event wearing a navy Tom Ford suit and a black baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, trying to avoid the cameras. The point wasn't to be seen. It was to breathe. After a week of board meetings, lawsuits, and watching his CFO resign mid-argument, Paxson needed anything that didn't feel like a Wall Street bloodbath. He never expected that something to be a woman. The moment he slid into the velvet seat in the darkened premiere theater, he noticed her sitting in the seat beside him like she owned the air around her. She was laughing, actually laughing at the animated short playing before the feature. And not the fake kind of laugh people give when they're trying to impress someone. It was real. Loud. Unapologetic. She glanced sideways and caught him staring. "Didn't peg you for a cartoon guy," she whispered, her voice low and teasing, like she didn't care who he was. "I didn't peg you for someone who laughs this hard at a squirrel falling off a tree," he said, deadpan. She grinned. It was a surprisingly emotional squirrel. He blinked. "Who is this woman?" "Stella," she added, offering her hand like they were at a coffee shop and not a sold-out Hollywood premiere. "Pax," he said, shaking her hand. He didn't give his last name. People acted weird when they knew who he was. She leaned closer. "Pax? That short for something? Or are you trying to sound mysterious?" He hesitated. "Paxson. Paxson," she repeated, rolling the name around like she was tasting it. "You look more like a Jack, but I'll allow it." The lights dimmed further, the announcer welcomed the crowd, and the movie began. But Paxson couldn't focus. Not on the A-lister on screen. Not on the $1 million budget playing out in front of him. All he could see out of the corner of his eye was her. Stella. She didn't shift uncomfortably. She didn't check her phone. She gasped at the right moments, laughed when something was funny, and wiped a tear near the end when the lead character said goodbye to his mother. And when the lights came back up, she turned to him and said, "I didn't expect to cry in public tonight. Don't tell anyone." He stared at her for a second too long. "I won't," he said softly. "Promise." People began filing out, buzzing with reviews and champagne plans. She stood up, brushing popcorn off her jeans. "You coming to the after party?" she asked casually, like they were already friends. He hesitated. "I wasn't planning to," he admitted. "Too cool for it? Too tired?" She raised an eyebrow. "Or too famous?" He stilled. "Relax," she said, smiling. "I don't care who you are. You're just Paxson who laughs at squirrels to me." He laughed. Actually laughed. She started walking, but paused and looked over her shoulder. "You should come. I hear they'll have those mini sliders you rich people like." He followed her out. The after party was in the rooftop garden of the Lux Hotel with string lights, live saxophone, and 3 different champagne bars. Paxson kept close to Stella. Not because he didn't know anyone, he knew everyone, but because she was the only one not trying to impress him. She took a slider, took a sip of champagne, and looked out over the city like it was hers. "So what do you do?" Paxson, who never answered that question. He studied her for a beat. She wasn't asking because she wanted something. She was just curious. "I'm in real estate," he said vaguely. She tilted her head. "You mean like I sell houses real estate? Or I own half the skyline real estate?" He shrugged. "Somewhere between." She narrowed her eyes. "You're being vague on purpose." "Maybe." She laughed. "Well, I'm a graphic designer. Freelance. Which is code for sometimes broke, sometimes not." "I like that," he said honestly. "What, honesty or instability?" "Both," he said, grinning. She nudged his arm. "You're weird. No one said that to me in a long time." "Well, you are." They stood in silence for a moment, the city humming beneath them. "I like you," he said before he could think better of it. She looked over at him, surprised. "I mean it. You're not fake." She smiled. "You're not as mysterious as you think you are." He stepped closer, so close their arms touched. "Stella," he said, slower now. "Can I see you again?" "Not here. Not with all this noise." She looked up at him. "Sure. But only if you stop hiding behind baseball caps." He took off the cap and tossed it on the table behind them. She grinned. "Better," she said. That night, when Paxson got into the back seat of his waiting Bentley, he stared out at the streetlights and felt something he hadn't in years: hope. The kind of hope that creeps in when you're not looking for it. His driver raised an eyebrow in the mirror. "Good night, sir." Paxson nodded slowly, still thinking about the way Stella's laugh had filled the theater. "Yeah," he said. "Better than good." The next time Paxson saw Stella, she was barefoot on the edge of a fountain in Echo Park, arms outstretched like she was daring gravity to forget its job. "I said casual," she called out when she saw him approaching. "You wore a button-down." "It's linen," he said, hands in his pockets. "That's my version of casual. You look like you're about to close a deal on a vineyard. And you look like you belong in a Sofia Coppola film." "Thank you," she said like it was a compliment she'd been waiting her whole life to hear. She hopped down from the fountain, her sundress fluttering around her knees, and walked toward him without hesitation, like they'd met in parks a dozen times before. He hadn't stopped thinking about her since the premiere. The way she didn't flinch in a room full of industry power, the way she'd spoken like time wasn't something to be hoarded. He wasn't used to people like that. He wasn't used to people who didn't ask what jet he flew in on or what Forbes list he was climbing. Today, she'd simply said, "Meet me by the lake. Around 4. Bring nothing." So he had. No assistant. No driver. Just Paxson and a pair of sneakers that still looked too expensive for grass. "You hungry?" she asked. "I could eat." "Good. Because I brought sandwiches." She led him to a shaded spot beneath a jacaranda tree where a checkered blanket was already laid out. A small cooler sat beside it and she crouched to unzip it. "You brought food?" he asked. "Don't sound so surprised. I'm not one of those women who think surviving on iced coffee is a personality trait." He sat beside her, watching as she unwrapped 2 sandwiches and handed him one. "Turkey, brie, arugula, and fig jam," she said. "Don't tell me you're allergic to flavor." He took a bite and raised his eyebrows. "This is incredible." "I know. I almost kept both for myself." They ate in silence for a few moments, the kind that didn't press for attention. Paxson glanced sideways and caught the way she was watching a couple rowing a boat across the lake. "You ever think about doing something totally different?" he asked. "Like what?" "Just walking away from it all. Starting over somewhere." She turned to him. "You mean like disappearing?" "Not forever," he said. "Just long enough to remember what real life feels like." She nodded slowly. "Sometimes. Yeah. But I think if you're running, you should at least know what you're running toward." He looked down at the sandwich in his hands. "Maybe I don't." "What about you?" she asked. "You seem like the type who's always in control." He exhaled through his nose. "Control's an illusion. The best you can do is hold your breath and hope the markets don't tank." She tilted her head. "So you are in finance?" He didn't answer right away. "Something like that." She didn't push. He liked that about her. "Want to see something weird?" she said suddenly, standing and brushing crumbs off her legs. "Sure." She led him to a small patch of grass near a stone path. There, in the middle of the lawn, was a circle of painted rocks, each one different bright colors, patterns, tiny messages scrawled in black marker. She crouched and picked one up. "This one's my favorite," she said, holding it out. It was painted yellow with the words, "You're still here." "That's enough," written in loopy handwriting. "People leave them here," she said. "Then take one when they need it." He crouched beside her. "Like emotional currency." "Exactly." He picked up a green one with a clumsy heart drawn in the center. "What happens if you take one and don't leave one?" She met his gaze. "Then you owe the universe a little beauty." Eventually, they stood, her hand brushing his as she placed the rock back in the circle. He didn't pull away. "I've never brought someone here before," she said after a moment. "Why me?" She looked up at him, unblinking. "Because you didn't talk through the movie." He laughed, surprised. "And because you didn't ask what I was wearing under the dress." He sobered. "Has that actually happened?" She nodded. "More than once." Paxson felt heat rise in his chest. "You deserve better. You don't know me." "I'd like to." She looked at him for a long beat. Then stopped being vague. He straightened. "You want the truth?" "Always. I own O'Connell Global. Real estate, hotels, theaters. Most of the premiere you saw last week was sponsored through my company." She blinked once. "You're that O'Connell?" He nodded. "I didn't lie. I just didn't lead with it." She crossed her arms. "Because you thought I'd treat you differently? Because I didn't want to wonder if you were only here for the perks." She didn't speak for a long time. Then she walked a few steps away and stared out at the lake. "So what now?" she asked. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I don't want to stop seeing you." She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "There's a lot you don't say." "I'm working on it." She nodded once. "Then maybe I'll keep showing up. For now." It wasn't a promise. But it wasn't a no. And for Paxson, who'd built his life on contracts and guarantees, that maybe felt more real than anything else. A week later, Paxson stood in front of a modest brick building just off Melrose with a paper cup of black coffee in one hand and a folded newspaper in the other, trying not to look completely out of place. He wore a simple charcoal sweater and dark jeans, no chauffeur, no assistant trailing behind him, no one watching his every move. Just him, the morning chill, and the woman who had somehow made his entire world feel like it had been tilted slightly off its axis. He'd asked Stella where she worked. She hadn't told him she'd drawn it, sketching a tiny storefront on a napkin and sliding it across the table like a secret. "You'll know it when you see it," she said. And he did. The sketch wasn't perfect, but it had character. Just like her. The door creaked as he entered the design studio. Inside, it smelled like coffee grounds and markers, the kind of scent that clung to inspiration. The walls were covered with mood boards and color swatches, and 2 desks sat cluttered with open sketchbooks and tangled headphones. A large corkboard displayed pinned Polaroids of hand-lettered signs, murals, and logos. "I was wondering when you'd show up," she said without looking up. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by scraps of paper and a half-built model of a pop-up gallery booth. "I had to circle the block 3 times, Paxson said. "There's no parking anywhere." She looked up then, her eyes bright. "That sounds like a you problem." He stepped closer, scanning the pieces scattered around her. "What is all this?" "Client pitch. They want an immersive art experience for their new fragrance launch. I'm trying to make a booth that smells like memories." He blinked. "That's a real thing?" She smiled. "It is if you sell it right." He crouched beside her, careful not to crush anything. "You're serious about this? You thought I just doodled for fun?" He looked around. "This place is alive. Then you get it." He sat on the edge of a work table, watching her rearrange translucent panels. "I don't think I've ever seen someone work like this. It's chaotic but deliberate." She nodded. "That's the only way I know how to make something worth looking at." They fell into a quiet rhythm. She explained her concept while he listened, asking questions not the kind meant to impress, but the kind that showed he was paying attention. When she finally glanced up at him again, her expression had shifted. "I didn't expect you to come here," she said. "I wasn't sure I should," he admitted. "But I kept thinking about that rock you showed me." She tilted her head. "The one with the message?" "The part about owing the universe beauty." She stood, brushing her hands on her paint-streaked jeans. "You don't strike me as someone who believes in the universe owing anyone anything." "I don't," he said. "But I believe in showing up." She stared at him for a long moment, and then her expression softened. "Come on," she said. "I want to show you something." She led him up a narrow staircase in the back of the studio that opened onto the rooftop. It wasn't glamorous. There were rusted chairs, cracked terracotta pots with wilting herbs, and a single umbrella that leaned at an odd angle, but the view stretched all the way out to where the city smudged into haze. "This is where I come when I need to remember I'm not small," she said. He stepped to the edge, taking it in. "You ever think about leaving all this behind?" She shook her head. "No. I built this. Every pin on that board downstairs is a fight I won. Every invoice I chased. Every time I walked into a room where no one remembered inviting me. This mess? It's mine. And I love it." He turned to her. "You're not what I expected. And you're more than I thought," she said. "But I don't know what to do with that yet." "Then let me help figure it out." They stood in silence, the city pulsing below them. She didn't move away when his fingers found hers. Later that evening, Paxson sat in the back of a silent town car, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past. His phone buzzed with messages he hadn't answered in hours. Investors, board members, a publicist panicking over a leaked earnings report. But all he could think about was how Stella had looked on that rooftop, defiant, grounded, and entirely herself. He tapped his driver on the shoulder. Change of plans. Take me to the penthouse. And call Dominique, have her meet me there. The driver adjusted the route without a word. Paxson unlocked the door to his penthouse and walked straight to the wall of windows. The city stretched endlessly in every direction, glittering like a promise. But tonight it felt hollow. Dominique, his longtime interior designer and occasional miracle worker, arrived minutes later, heels echoing on the marble. "You're either redecorating or spiraling," she said, setting her tote on the kitchen counter. "Both, maybe," he said. "I want to turn the East Wing into a working studio. Light, space, supplies, everything." She narrowed her eyes. "For you?" "No. For someone who doesn't know I'm doing it yet." Dominique blinked. "This is a woman thing, isn't it?" He didn't answer. She exhaled. "How soon?" 3 days. "You're insane. Just make it beautiful." Dominique gave him a long look, then reached for her phone. "Fine, but I'm billing you overtime." When she was gone, Paxson walked to the oversized closet in his bedroom. He stared at the rows of perfectly tailored suits, the lined-up cufflinks, the untouched cologne bottles. He pulled open a drawer and stared at the watch inside, a gift from his father before he passed, a reminder that time waits for no one. He closed the drawer. The next morning, Stella found an envelope slid under the studio door. Inside was a single sheet of paper hand-inked in thick black marker. "You're still here. That's enough." And beneath it, a note in his handwriting, "But I want to give you more than enough. Come to me Friday night. No expectations. Just presence." The address printed at the bottom wasn't a restaurant. It wasn't a gallery. It was a penthouse in the sky. Stella stood outside the penthouse entrance, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her coat, heart rattling against her ribs like it had something urgent to say. The doorman had nodded and stepped aside with a quiet respect that made her feel like she'd just crossed an invisible threshold, a place where people whispered names they never expected to say aloud. She hadn't answered Paxson's note, hadn't called, hadn't sent a message. She'd just shown up. Because deep down, behind all the reasons she shouldn't trust a man who could buy a skyline, there was something stronger. Curiosity, pull, and, if she was being honest, the echo of his voice that had somehow taken root in her mind. When the elevator opened, she stepped inside without hesitation. It ascended with a smooth, almost soundless ease, the city falling away beneath her. Then, without her pressing a single button, the doors opened. The first thing she noticed was the silence. Not the cold kind, but the kind that hums with anticipation. Then she saw him. Paxson stood barefoot in front of a wide wall of windows, sleeves rolled up, a charcoal pencil in his hand. The room had been transformed, no longer sterile or curated. Tables lined with art supplies, rolls of canvas on the floor, a high drafting table near the balcony. It wasn't a replica of her studio. It was something else entirely. An offering. He turned, setting the pencil down. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "I wasn't either." He nodded once. "But you did." She stepped farther into the room, her eyes grazing the details, the worn leather stool, the open sketch pad with half-finished lines, the framed photo of the lake from Echo Park. Her fingers curled around the strap of her bag. "Why did you build this?" "Because I didn't know how else to show you what you mattered to me without trying to change you." Her gaze flicked to his. "You think this changes me?" "No," he said softly. "I think it's the first thing I've ever built that wasn't about profit." She looked around again, slower this time. "It's not perfect. I didn't want perfect," he said, crossing the room. "I wanted honest." There was something different in his posture tonight, less guarded, like the weight he carried had shifted. She noticed the faint smudge of graphite on his wrist, the uneven way his shirt was tucked in on one side. "You've been drawing," she said. "I'm terrible at it." She walked to the table, picking up the sketch pad. The lines were rough, mostly architectural outlines, bridges, towering facades, but then a face. Unfinished. Her face. The curve of her cheek, the loose suggestion of her hair. Her breath caught. "I wasn't trying to make it look like you," he said quickly. "I just couldn't stop seeing you." She closed the sketchbook gently, setting it down. "I don't know how to be with someone who lives in a world this far from mine," she admitted. "I don't even own a pair of heels that would fit in here." He stepped closer, voice low. "Then I'll meet you on your ground. Or we'll make new ground." She tilted her head. "You think it's that easy?" "I think it's worth figuring out." She studied his face. There was no performance in him tonight. No curated charm or billionaire polish. Just a man who had been stripped down to something real. "I'm not good at slow," she said. "When I fall hard." "I'm not asking for slow," he said. "I'm asking for true." Her pulse thudded in her ears. "I've spent so long building around myself," she whispered. "I don't know if I remember how to let someone in." He reached out, not touching her yet, just letting his hand hover near hers. "Then let this be the first door." She didn't move for a long breath. Then finally she slid her fingers into his. It wasn't a kiss that followed. It was something quieter. More anchored. Her forehead resting against his, their hands clasped like a vow not yet spoken. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the studio space, washing the room in warmth. Stella stood in front of the drafts table, barefoot, wrapped in one of Paxson's crisp white shirts, flipping through a stack of untouched sketch paper. He entered from the kitchen, 2 mugs in hand. She took one, inhaling the scent. "You have good coffee taste," she said. "I had help," he replied. "Called your studio. Asked your assistant what she keeps stocked for emergencies." She laughed, setting the mug down. "You're absurd." "Possibly." She walked to the window, gazing out across the city. "What happens next?" He joined her, the morning light catching in his hair. "We stop pretending we're from different worlds. You still have an empire to run. And you still have clients who believe you can bottle nostalgia." She turned. "You're not going to try and buy my time, are you?" His eyes searched hers. "No. I want to be part of it." A knock interrupted them. Paxson crossed the room and opened the door to reveal a deliverman holding a long black box. "For you," he said, handing it to Paxson before disappearing again. "What is it?" Stella asked as he brought it over. He set the box on the table and opened it to reveal a row of hand-bound sketchbooks, each one with her name embossed in gold. Inside the first page of the top book was a single line in his handwriting. "Let's start from here." She looked up at him, eyes glossy. "I didn't know what to get someone who already sees everything," he said. "So I thought I'd give you space to keep it." She stepped forward and kissed him finally, fully not as a question but as an answer. Months later, the first show opened in a converted warehouse downtown. Stella's designs lit the gallery like stained glass, each installation layered with sound, scent, and light. At the center stood the very first booth she ever pitched, the immersive fragrance memory, and beside it, a plaque that read, "Dedicated to the man who saw the whole picture before I did." Paxson stood behind her, his hand at her waist, no cap, no disguise. Across the room, someone whispered his name. "Should I be worried?" she asked, her hand finding his. "Not unless you think I'm going to buy the building." She raised an eyebrow. "Too late," he said. She laughed, leaning into him. And in that moment, with applause echoing through the space, her name on every guest's lips and his love wrapped around her like a second skin, Stella knew she hadn't just captured a billionaire's heart. She'd rebuilt it brick by brick, laugh by laugh, until it finally had room for 2. 3 weeks later, Stella stood in the center of her new gallery space, her hands covered in dried paint, her voice hoarse from hours of directing. The final installation was nearly complete, an interactive piece built from found objects and sculpted light that changed colors based on movement. The team bustled around her, adjusting wires and testing sensors, but her eyes kept drifting to the clock. She hadn't seen Paxson in 4 days. He'd flown to Zurich for an emergency summit with global investors, something about a luxury property division that had gone sideways. He hadn't said much before leaving. Just a kiss to her temple, a whispered, "I'll be back before you miss me," and a look in his eyes that lingered longer than his words. She missed him anyway. But more than that, she worried. Not about the business he could rebuild his empire in his sleep, but about the space between them, the one that had begun to stretch now that their lives were moving at the same relentless speed. She'd spent years building something out of nothing. So had he. But now they were building something together, and that kind of work didn't come with blueprints. As she reached for a ladder to help reposition a light fixture, someone called her name from the entrance. "You're not supposed to be here until next week," she said, half laughing as she turned. But it wasn't her assistant. It was Paxson. He was dressed in an open-collar white shirt and dark slacks, his coat slung over one shoulder, but his eyes were what caught her breath. There was something different in them, like he'd arrived not just from another country, but from a decision he'd finally made. "You're early," she said, stepping down from the ladder, wiping her hands on a rag. "I couldn't wait." She crossed the room to him, stopping only when they were inches apart. "You didn't text." "I didn't want to text. I wanted to say it to your face." She tilted her head. "Say what?" "That I've been thinking." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "About this." She opened it and saw a layout drawing of a building, a sleek, minimalistic structure with enormous glass walls and a rooftop garden. Her name was on the top corner. So was his. Underneath, in bold letters, the Stella Center for Design and Innovation. She looked up at him, stunned. "What is this?" "It's not a gift," he said quickly. "It's a proposal. Not the kind with a diamond, though. Well, we'll get there, eventually. This is a space. For your work. For your artists. For anyone who sees the world differently and wants to make it better. I've already acquired the property. You'd run it. However you want. I wouldn't even have a key." Her throat tightened. "Why?" "Because I believe in you. Because I want to create something that lasts longer than glass towers and corner offices. Because when I'm with you, I remember that I'm not just a man who builds things, I'm someone who can feel them, too." She stared at the paper, then looked up again. "You didn't have to do this." "I know," he said. "But I wanted to." She stepped forward, slid the paper onto a nearby table, and wrapped her arms around his waist. "I don't need a center," she whispered. "I just need you to keep showing up." "I will. You promise." "With everything I have." She leaned back just enough to look into his eyes. "Then yes." "Yes to what?" "To everything. To the center. To us. To whatever future we build." He kissed her, then, not with hesitation, not with question, but with the certainty of a man who had finally found his home. That night, they returned to his penthouse. The studio remained untouched, the sketchbooks still in their place, the light soft and amber around them. She curled into his side on the couch, her head against his chest, his fingers tracing slow shapes along her shoulder. "I was scared," she said quietly. "So was I. I didn't think two people who built their lives alone could ever figure out how to build together." He pulled her closer. "Turns out we just needed the right foundation." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other, the city blinking quietly below, no longer daunting, no longer distant. A year later, the Stella Center opened its doors with a 3-day art festival that drew creators from across the world. The rooftop garden buzzed with conversation, live music, and installations that pulsed with color and innovation. Paxson stood beside Stella as she cut the ribbon, cameras flashing, guests clapping, but his attention never left her. Later that night, as the last guests trickled out and the moon cast silver light over the city, he took her hand and led her to the center of the rooftop. "I have one more proposal," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Another building?" He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. "No. Just forever." When he opened it, the ring inside wasn't flashy. It wasn't massive. It was a vintage setting, delicate and timeless, with a design that mirrored the shape of the very first logo she ever drew. Her breath caught. "You remembered." "I remember everything." She didn't wait. She didn't hesitate. She said yes before he could even finish the question. They married the following spring in the rooftop garden, where it all began, under the same string lights, with the same jazz band from the premiere playing a softer tune. Her dress was simple, her smile radiant. His vows were spoken without a script, just a promise from a man who had once built empires but now only wanted to build a life. Together, they didn't just fall in love. They created something none of them could have built alone, a future grounded in passion, partnership, and presence. And every morning, no matter where they were in the world, they still found time to sketch together. Sometimes with pencils. sometimes with words, always with love.